Over the last century, Andrewsarchus has undergone numerous reinterpretations. Wild speculations have gradually given way to very slightly less wild speculations, spurred on by very little in the way of new fossil evidence and a lot more looking at the same fossil from different angles. Andrewsarchus is still commonly referred to as the largest terrestrial mammalian carnivore ever, but new insights throw a spanner in this fantasy. So, was Andrewsarchus a carnivorous hooved wolf or a hairless terrestrial hippo? Did it drink the blood of its enemies or nibble tentatively at roots and tubers? In this video, we're going to examine the superb skull of a gigantic beast and look at all the weird and wonderful monsters that it inspired. Let's start with what we know. Almost everything we assume about Andrewsarchus comes from the kind of fossil paleontologists must have a love-hate relationship with. On one hand, the monstrous skull is definitely the coolest part of any animal, and one of the single most useful in terms of inferring things about it. But on the other, it's only a skull. There are no limbs, no vertebrae, no tail, or anything else that might give us more clues about this animal. The skull itself is an absolute unit, though, almost a meter long, 56 centimeters wide, and supporting an elongated maxilla with teeth that were described as of enormous size. The whole thing was described around the time of its discovery as the superb skull of a giant beast, and this was by Roy Chapman Andrews, who managed to get his name attached to it for leading the expedition. But it was his young assistant paleontologist, Can Chuen Pao, who made the actual discovery, and Pao-Sarkis would definitely have made the animal sound a lot less like a Lord of the Rings actor. And to be a bit pedantic, it's not even a skull, but just the cranium, the upper bones of the skull, lacking the mandible. But of any single bone in the body, a cranium offers perhaps the most information about any animal. It's where the teeth are, for one thing, and these ideally make it pretty clear as to what it ate. The position of the eyes, too, shows us a bit about its position in the ecosystem, and the muscle connection surfaces on the skull give us clues around how and what it bit. A mandible, or lower jaw, was found in 1957, and after being associated with a variety of different animals, it is now thought to have belonged to Andrewsarchus. But as the only part of a skull find that wasn't pulverized beyond recognition, even this is in bad shape. Still, between both sides of this crushed mandible, there are more or less a full set of teeth, and we'll come back to the discussion around these in a little while. So while there are limited inferences to be made from the skull itself, we can tell a lot about the environment that this animal lived in, simply from looking at where it was found. So before we indulge ourselves in speculation, let's set the scene. Andrewsarchus lived in the hothouse climates of the Middle Eocene, around 48 to 38 million years ago. Its holotype was found in what is now Inner Mongolia, and at the time this would have been warm, humid, and rich in flora. At this time there were primates, crocodilians, and tapirs as far north as the high Arctic, and no ice at the poles. Mongolia would have been a tropical or semi-tropical environment where small primitive ungulates pranced around in the woodlands. Today, ungulates are split into two very uneven orders: the artiodactyls, which contain almost all large mammalian herbivores, and the perissodactyls, which contain the three exceptions: horses, rhinos, and tapirs. But in the time of Andrewsarchus, the roles were reversed, and Mongolia was almost exclusively the realm of Perissodactyla. Monster 10-ton rhino relatives like Brontotheres would have had to defend against the emerging predatory orders like Hyenodonta, and smaller animals were faced with rising mesopredator groups such as Mesonychidae. And it's this latter family that plays a pivotal role in the story of Andrewsarchus. Its taxonomy has been all over the place, and it's still not settled, having once been considered a basal member of Artiodactyla and then a sister taxon to them. Most recent evidence points to them being unrelated entirely and having no close relatives around today. So while we know pretty well where and when it lived, arguments abound over exactly what it was. For a very long time, all that was known about Andrewsarchus came from that one cranium found in Mongolia in 1923. and it was initially thought to be a gargantuan mesonychid. Mesonychids have been described as wolves with hooves, a sort of crossover between artiodactyls and carnivores, and this is where the earliest interpretation of Andrewsarchus comes from. Since the skull was believed to be a member of the mesonychid family, the type genus of this family, Mesonyx, was used as the basis for extrapolation, and Andrewsarchus was given the title of largest predatory land mammal that ever existed. This was then a monster, wolf-like predator with horse's hooves and a shoulder height taller than the average person. Its length was estimated at around 4 meters, and it was said to have weighed around a ton, often depicted with thick, shaggy, dense fur and a menacing grin. In the social consciousness, Andrewsarchus was taking on the role of Mork from the Never-Ending Story, an ethereal force of destruction personified from images out of our nightmares. But these images would turn out to be premature. The so-named giant mesonychid of Mongolia wouldn't live up to the hype exactly, most importantly because it wasn't the mesonychid. It was hard to ignore the teeth, which, while huge and pointy, weren't obviously specialized for a hypercarnivorous diet. Its incisors are almost as big as its canines, and more closely resemble those of a hippo or pig in that regard. And its premolars are distinctly familiar. They are unicuspid, just like those found in hell pigs or entelodonts. The molars themselves have wrinkled crowns, just like those found in modern pigs. Now, pigs are no doubt some of the most underrated, brutal, and tenacious flesh-eaters the world has ever seen, but they're far from exclusively carnivorous. Pigs will bite into a yam just as enthusiastically as they'll bite through a human femur, and their teeth reflect this. By 1924, there were already papers coming out that compared Andrewsarchus to entelodonts. And as we know, entelodonts have themselves been described as monster predatory pigs, and we even have a video on that, so check it out. But all signs are pointing to Andrewsarchus being more omnivorous than predatory, and this changes things a bit. Another thing that led researchers to this conclusion was the jaw musculature. The places where the jaw muscles attach, like the sagittal crest on the top of the skull, and the shape of the jaw joint itself are not as robust as you'd expect for an animal that regularly brought down large prey. In fact, the skull of Andrewsarchus has a reduced crest and a very flat jaw joint, which indicates a relatively weak bite force for its size. That's a bit of an anticlimax for the largest land carnivore, as it's likely Andrewsarchus might have had a bite that was weaker than a modern big cat. All of these hints point to a more generalist feeder. Perhaps it was content to scavenge carcasses, crack bones for marrow, explode turtles or mollusks, and occasionally hunt smaller animals that it could swallow whole. By 2001, this idea was entering the public consciousness, and in Walking with Beasts, Andrewsarchus was portrayed as a wolf-like carrion feeder and scavenger. By this point, the association between this animal and the artiodactyls was well established, and it led to the fantastic description of a sheep in wolf's clothing. But it would eventually come about that the family ties of this mysterious monster are apparently found more in the water than on land. Rather than woolly, they may have been almost entirely hairless. Just before we finish up, we'd like to say again that your viewership is really appreciated. And if you're enjoying these videos, you can really help us out by subscribing to the channel, clicking the like button, and sharing them with anybody you think might be interested. Now, although researchers still rely primarily on this single cranium, recent close inspections have advanced the understanding of where this animal is placed taxonomically. Today, there is a clade of living artiodactyls known as Whippomorpha that includes hippos and cetaceans. These are closely related, and they've descended from terrestrial ungulates, from whom they branched off around 50 million years ago. 50 million years ago is very slightly before the known Andrewsarchus fossils show up. But around that time, there was a land-roaming whale from the Indian subcontinent known as Pachycetus. This time, it probably was a wolf-like animal, and it would have spent a lot of time underwater. This animal is the ancestor to all modern whales, and its closest non-whale relative appears to be the hippo. It's now thought that Andrewsarchus can be grouped into Whippomorpha too, in a clade that expands to contain all of their extinct relatives like Pachycetus, and is called Cetanchodontomorpha. This contemporary reclassification separates Andrewsarchus from the entelodonts at the superfamily level, but some also suggest that it could be ancestral to these hell pigs, who arrived on the scene a few million years later. And assuming Andrewsarchus was more closely related to entelodonts and hippos, the dimensions and appearance of its reconstructions can change dramatically. Now it can be portrayed as a relatively hairless, chunky animal, with proportions more akin to those of a rhino and a blubbery, round, hippo-like head. So we've gone from hooved, hypercarnivorous wolf to hooved, not-so-carnivorous, hairy, pig-like animal to finally hoofless, stocky, hairless, leathery land hippo that scavenges wherever it can find. But all of these ideas are still mostly speculative. It could have been related or even basal to early entelodonts, providing the blueprint that the future hell pigs would expand upon as they increased in specialities. These questions all have yet to be answered, and they themselves throw up even more. Did Andrewsarchus fight with its teeth in the water like a hippo? Did it chase down prey? Did it scavenge or ambush? Would it have tasted like pork? Aside from a handful of teeth and a highly damaged mandible, the only thing we've got to go on is that single large cranium. But in the meantime, the mystery surrounding Andrewsarchus allows us to build up any kind of monster ungulate around it. So perhaps Andrewsarchus wasn't the largest terrestrial mammalian predator at all. Perhaps it didn't have hooves either. It likely wasn't very wolf-like, and maybe it looked a lot more like a giant semi-aquatic pig. But as we approach the limit of what we can garner from a single sample, the anticipation around finding more fossils like it increases. And in the meantime, we can still make up all kinds of weird and wonderful artistic renderings to describe it. That's all for this video. Thanks for watching.